Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the July 12th work session of the County Board on the Missing Middle Housing Study. We are so glad to be joined by so many Arlingtonians here in our boardroom this afternoon. We know this is a conversation that has inspired a lot of interest and strong opinions, and I know that my colleagues and I will really appreciate the conversations we've had with so many members of our community over the past 2 years, and certainly in recent weeks, whether that be with individuals, civic groups, civic associations, or others. We are looking forward to many additional conversations in the weeks to come, months to come, as summarized in the handout everyone has received, and as we will be talking about in greater depth at the end of the conversation today. A note, however, that today is a work session, that is to say an opportunity for the County Board to learn from our staff about Phase 2 and to share thoughts about where the Missing Middle Housing Study goes next. There is not a hearing. There will be no votes taken today. Put differently, the Arlington County Zoning Ordinance and General Land Use Plan will be exactly the same walking out of this room as they were walking into this room today. Binding votes to amend the county's code and planning documents will come after multiple additional months of engagement and public hearings before the County Board and the Planning Commission with public testimony. So we really welcome having so many folks here to listen and learn alongside of us. If it's going to be difficult for you or for your group to engage with the content or listen to the content without reacting audibly or disruptively, we understand, but we do invite you to do so by watching the live stream somewhere other than this boardroom. If we have disruptions, you are going to get a visit from our clerk or county office staff encouraging you to go watch the live stream elsewhere. If there are extensive disruptions, we will clear the room and, consistent with Virginia open meetings laws, continue to meet with the live stream available but with the boardroom closed. I am certain it will not come to that. We really appreciate those who have joined us and know that that will not be an issue today. As I turn this over to the manager, I just want to say one more word about why we are here. Following the objective 1.1.10 of the Affordable Housing Master Plan in 2015, which made it the policy of the county to explore flexibility in housing types within single-family neighborhoods, our staff began with a massive research project about 2 years ago, which became a compendium of data and analysis about Arlington's housing stock, about our local and regional housing market, and the 90-year evolution of our land use policies. The context of our history and the trajectory of our status quo collectively have created an imperative for us to explore change. The specifics of that change, of course, are major ones and the ones that bring us to this table today. And with that, I am so glad to welcome our staff who have been working so hard, and I will turn it first to County Manager Mark Schwartz to introduce them.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. This afternoon, you're going to hear from Matt Ladd, who will begin the presentation, assisted by Erica Moore, who will then turn it back to Matt Ladd. We have a number of staff also available, including Kelly Brown and a number of people who've worked hard on this. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ladd.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Manager. And thank you, County Board. My name is Matt Ladd with the Department of Community Planning, Housing and Development, and I'm joined today by our study team. And for the work session agenda, I will begin with an overview of the study and the key elements of the Phase 2 framework that was released in late April for community review and input. Then I'll hand it over to our CPHD Communications Manager, Erica Moore, who will present an overview of the community engagement over the last 2.5 months. We'll pause for discussion on our community engagement and feedback. Then I will present key elements of the draft framework, along with policy options and considerations for maintaining or modifying those elements. We'll pause the presentation for focused board discussion on each topic. Finally, we'll discuss the schedule going forward and next steps for the study. We'll start with the overview of Phase 2 and its key elements. As a reminder, the Missing Middle Housing Study started in 2020 with the goals of increasing the county's housing supply and allowing a wider range of housing options. The objectives for the policies being considered in Phase 2 is to allow more equitable housing options that meet housing needs for people at more income levels at more stages of life distributed throughout Arlington. We started this study with a research phase to provide baseline data and an understanding of the challenges in Arlington's housing market and the history of restrictive land use in the county. In Phase 1, we engaged with the community on their priorities and concerns about expanding housing choice. Phase 2 has been a focused analysis of different housing types and how they could fit into Arlington's context. This analysis informed a draft framework that seeks to address the community priorities and concerns from Phase 1. Consistent with the study scope released in 2020, staff is bringing forward the findings of the Phase 2 analysis and a summary of community feedback on the draft framework for County Board consideration, which is what brings us here today. And if directed by the board, in Phase 3, we will be developing new zoning text to implement the policy framework. These are the primary priorities and concerns for expanding housing choice coming out of the year-long community engagement during Phase 1. Staff released a draft policy framework for community review and input in late April. This draft is a preliminary approach for expanding housing choice that seeks to address and balance the Phase 1 priorities and concerns shown on the previous slide. It presents the public with specific policy choices and trade-offs, but I want to emphasize that it is not a staff recommendation. The draft framework includes new housing types with the same design and building placement requirements as single detached housing. Buildings with 2 to 8 units would be allowed only if they meet standards for height, setbacks, lot coverage, etc. As it is drafted now, the framework applies to zoning districts that only allow single detached development today, which are the R5, R6, R8, R10, and R20 zones. Analysis focused on new construction, but the framework would also allow the conversion of existing homes. There are 2 standards in the framework that differ from single detached development. First, minimum parking requirements go from 1 space per unit to 0.5 spaces per unit. We'll talk more about parking in more detail when we get to the policy options portion of the work session. The framework also limits the total allowed square footage of a building. These maximums are designed to encourage the production of more 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units rather than 5-bedroom duplexes. Missing middle housing is not completely missing in Arlington. The orange areas on this map on the slide show locations where townhouses, duplexes, triplexes, and other small-scale multiplex housing exists today. In some cases, these are concentrated in areas where this housing is already allowed by zoning. But there are also examples of missing middle housing that predate stricter zoning laws, interspersed with single detached housing. The public can explore areas of existing middle housing through the virtual walking tours posted on our website. Now I'm going to hand it over to Erica Moore, who will present on who we reached out to and what we heard.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, County Board. For the record, I'm Erica Moore, and I am the Communications and Engagement Manager for CPHD. Over the next few slides, I'll share an overview of the Phase 2 engagement. First, I do want to note that we've put together a detailed engagement of all the feedback we heard over the past 2.5 months, and that was shared with the board ahead of this meeting for your consideration, and it is posted on our Missing Middle Housing Study web pages for the public. This engagement period, which began in late April, focused on reaching people in a variety of ways, both to share information about the framework and solicit comments and feedback. We mailed postcards announcing the posting of the draft framework and opportunities to participate to more than 151,000 residential addresses, including apartment buildings. As Matt just noted, we put together virtual walking tours of Arlington neighborhoods to show where the proposed housing types exist today. And we also developed infographics summarizing the framework and did continuous promotion of the opportunities through our online channels. One of our goals for this engagement period was to meet people where they are and bring new people into the engagement process. So we held pop-ups at strategic locations around the county to engage both with people who would potentially benefit from expanding housing options in the county and those who live in areas that would see more housing options if the framework were adopted. We also translated our engagement materials into 4 languages: Spanish, Amharic, Arabic, and Mongolian. And we did direct outreach with those communities to get the word out. We also did direct outreach with community partners and other groups, including the Civic Federation, the Chamber of Commerce, Bugada, and the NAACP, as well as the Forestry and Natural Resources Commission, the Commission on Aging, and the Housing Commission. As you know, interest in the Missing Middle Housing Study is strong, and we have heard from thousands of people since the framework was posted, with more comments continuing to come in. We heard from 2,566 people in our online feedback form that closed on May 27th. But as I've mentioned, that form was only one way that people could engage with us. From May 28th to June 30th, we received an additional 322 open-ended comments through a second online form, which we have analyzed for this report. More than 100 additional comments on that form have been submitted since June 30th, and those comments were sent to you directly for your consideration and review. In addition, we received 279 emails and letters directly from the community as of June 30th. The pop-up engagements provided us an opportunity to engage with people face-to-face, and we spoke to hundreds of Arlington residents and received hundreds of pieces of feedback about the draft framework that we may not have received otherwise. And it is important to note that not everyone we spoke to at pop-ups elected to tell us their feedback right there at the moment. Some wanted to do the entire online feedback form, and others just wanted to put a sticker on one or two housing types to provide that feedback. A quick look at the demographics. We could only collect demographics for that online feedback form, and the questions were optional. And you'll see particularly in the question about race and ethnicity, the prefer not to respond was the second most selected option. Participation in the online feedback form is heavily toward the single-family detached homeowners, as has historically been true of our online engagements. You'll see on the right that the reported demographics in the feedback form don't align directly with the overall demographics of the county in housing type and occupancy, meaning rent versus own, as well as race and ethnicity. So in planning our engagements, we did use the county's equity lens. We looked at who benefits, who is burdened, who is missing, and how do we know? And then the fifth follow-on is, what are we going to do about it? And so that's where we work to determine especially who would be missing potentially from the conversation and how do we reach them. And that's why we strategically placed our pop-ups in areas where we are more likely to engage with renters, residents in multifamily buildings, such as outside the Crystal City Metro, in Shirlington, in Roslyn, at Courthouse, and we also hosted one pop-up entirely in Spanish at the Mega Mart grocery store. And on this map of civic associations, you'll see that we have participation from every civic association in the county except for the Cherry Valley Nature Area, and the participation was spread across the county from north to south. Our feedback form did provide an opportunity for open-ended comments, and we compiled 1,694 comments that we received and tagged them according to their topics and themes. As you know, the community has been passionate on missing middle housing in response to the draft framework, and that was reflected in the comments that we received, both from those that are opposed to the framework and those that are in favor of it. Generally, comments on the feedback form were more negative than positive, but there were some that were mixed, with both positive and negative things to say about the framework. The top theme in these comments was growth, with comments both for and against additional density in the county. Commenters spoke to concerns about the impacts on schools, traffic, and their general quality of life. There were some commenters that found growth to be a positive thing and really supported opportunities for more people to live in the county. We did have people who commented that had concerns about the overall study and our engagement, as well as a few who said they did not think there was a housing issue in Arlington. Similar for the open-ended comments overview, we analyzed again the 322 open-ended comments received by June 30th. The top theme from these, again, was growth, but there were some new top themes here that we didn't see before, including housing costs, both those that were appreciative of a wider range of prices and those that were skeptical about the anticipated prices from the missing middle. And there were concerns that missing middle housing would only benefit developers or real estate investors and landlords. And then we also had people that were very concerned about the impacts on existing property values and taxes. Finally, in our open-ended feedback are the emails and letters we received. We've received hundreds of them from the community. These emails actually skewed more heavily positive about the framework. We responded to questions received in our online FAQ on our study webpage and posted a response matrix. That response matrix today has been continuously updated, and today includes 46 pages of staff responses to questions. We are also working through direct responses to all of the emails that we've received. These next slides show feedback received on some of the specific topics that you'll be discussing today, and we provide them to you as a data point for consideration. The one mandatory question in the online feedback form asked participants to rate each of the proposed housing types. Responses of one or two would indicate someone did not like a housing type, while 4 or 5 would mean somebody did like a housing type. You'll see that a majority of the responses on the feedback form were 1 ratings for all housing types. The second highest response rate was 5, showing that people are overwhelmingly on one end of the spectrum or the other. We replicated the first feedback form question for our pop-up engagements. You can see an image of the board that we used there. We invited people to place a sticker on their rating for each housing type, and you will see that the majority of the ratings given to us at pop-ups were 5s for all housing types. And just for comparison, we've put a stacked chart here of the data on the previous 2 slides for you. We asked feedback from the feedback form participants if they would exclude any of the housing types from the framework, and 67% of the participants said yes. You will see that there's a strong difference of opinion between different stakeholders, however. A strong majority of our participants who identified as homeowners and those who said that they live in single-family detached housing wanted to see housing types excluded from the framework, while majority of the participants who identified as renters and those that said they lived in apartments, condos, and townhouses said they did not want to see any of the housing types excluded. And of those participants who wanted to exclude housing types from the framework, we asked them which ones they would exclude, and you'll see that most people chose the housing types with more units. Oh, another point for you to consider is 645 participants chose to exclude every housing type from the framework, essentially meaning they didn't support the framework in any. How many was that, sorry? 645, sir. Then if a participant said they would exclude a housing type from the framework, we did ask them to tell us why, and they could select up to 3 reasons. The top reasons selected were the potential benefits did not outweigh the potential impacts, the increase of on-street parking and the number of cars, and the ability of county facilities to support additional residents. We did provide an opportunity for people to indicate that they just did not support missing middle housing under any circumstances, and you'll see 310 people selected that option, and they, same with the, I apologize, 382, and then there was folks that they do not think there's a need for missing middle housing, and that was 310 people. As you've seen on previous slides, parking was top of mind for many participants in our engagement process, and we asked for feedback about the parking requirements in the draft framework, and a majority of people who answered this question said they would like to see the county retain the current 1 space per unit standard. And finally, we've heard a lot from the community throughout this study over the past couple of years about the current teardown trend and large single-family home redevelopment. That's not part of this scope of the missing middle housing study, but it could be a follow-on study. So we did ask participants in the feedback form how important they thought it was that the county review its standards for single household development. And as you can see, a large majority of participants felt it was very important to do. And that concludes a summary of the Phase 2 public engagement and community feedback. Again, the full detailed report is on our study webpage. And Madam Chair, I turn it back to you for any discussions or questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ms. Moore. Really appreciate that summary, both of what the tactics for engagement were as well as the results. I'm going to open the floor to colleagues. At this point, we are not giving any of our feedback to staff. It is simply an opportunity for reflections and or questions about how the engagement process worked or what we learned from it. Mr. DeFranti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the work. Got a chance to review the FAQs webinar you did. I appreciate your work on that, Ms. Moore. I just want to, if it's possible, can we go to slide 18? Slides 18 and 20 were the most striking for me. Slide 18 is the pop-up locations, and I was trying to just 18.
Go around with this one. No, 18.
18.
Housing types pop-up.
That's 14.
Yeah, housing types pop-ups.
A couple more. So, and maybe you have it, but I think you mentioned Megamart, Crystal City. Are you able to just share those so that I can make sure I've got those locations?
Yes, Crystal City, outside the Crystal City Metro, at Westover Library, in Quincy Park, Bluemont Park, Shirlington, we were right next to the footbridge there. Roslyn Plaza for the farmers market there that they do. We were also in Roslyn for Bike to Work Day, and then we were at the Courthouse Farmers Market.
That's helpful. That together with slide 20, which talks about that has the 2 different graphs, one homeowners and one renters, really kind of struck me as the majority of what we've heard, to be fair, has been opposed to the missing middle direction, but we have heard from a number of renters. And so I guess the question is, there's a lot of numeric metrics, based on the whole presentation. Is that a theme that we should be humble and clear that as much as everybody in this room really cares about missing middle, there's a whole probably 100,000 Arlingtonians who've never actually heard of it. But I don't know if those themes of home ownership and renter kind of stood out to you, and if the pop-ups, you think the results from those pop-ups might have been because of a larger renter population.
So we did not, there we go. We did not collect demographic data at the pop-ups, obviously, and we were having conversations. We were engaging with folks for a few minutes, most of them not aware fully of the missing middle housing study, so doing some education as well. And I can tell you anecdotally, I spoke to a great number of renters and folks that live in multifamily housing and shared that. But I can't quantify that for you. But certainly we did place ourselves in areas where we were hoping to capture folks that perhaps maybe weren't aware of our engagement processes historically and could be brought into the process.
Thank you. I'll share the mic.
Thank you. Is Mr. Karantonis and Mr. Dorsey? Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ms. Gardner.
She actually answered like the question I was going to ask for the moment.
Love when
so
that
we're good.
happens. Great, Mr. Karantonis.
Same slides, 17 to 21. So,
Could you bring your microphone a little closer?
sorry, I thought this had enough gain. So the 17 to 21. So it's obvious that in the online form there is a progression from smaller housing type to the bigger housing type, and it breaks at some points. Well, I see, for example, that in the less tolerable, less preferred town choices. The townhomes and duplexes are about 30% of those who don't want them, so 70% actually do. Triplexes and quadruplexes seem to be around 50%, and then the bigger ones, sextuplexes and octuplexes, seem to be the other side of the preference in the Likert scale. My question to you is, how should we be reading that? Is that more the familiarity with that? So duplex, for example, is a familiar thing. So what is? I understand that from the online form you cannot know that, but definitely from the interactions at pop-ups you can, because at pop-ups you can one can ask, well, what is it, sextuplex, for example?
And thank you. Yes, we did have to do a little bit of explaining of that, particularly with the idea that these could be done within what is currently allowed for a single-family home. I think that was confusing for people. They were imagining, apartment buildings and things like that. So I think there is at the pop-ups, again, anecdotally, a lack of awareness of what that necessarily looked like. But I also think it was a lot of, I heard from folks that I talked to, and I'll let others talk because others were there with us, more that they just weren't sure what that would mean, right? A duplex is, to your point, they're maybe more familiar with them. They know of one in their neighborhood. And some of the more higher units, they just weren't sure. And I think that's also where you will see the reason being the potential benefit with the potential impacts, that trade-off just being a bit of a concern for a lot of people.
I would just add to that certainly in the pop-ups, and I believe in the online form, the question was accompanied with the images that were produced for the Phase 2 presentation that are shown, very small on this slide because it was a big board. But the prototype images of the different housing types were provided along with the question.
Thank you. Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure that there's a question here, but an overall comment. I think it's pretty fair to say that from a staff-directed process, the level of engagement here has been unprecedented and quite creative, and has been both targeted and broad. It's kind of hit all of the elements of what effective engagement means in order to be able to capture a wide variety of input. It hasn't looked like a lot of processes that we've had in the past that have involved people directly in committing to a depth of engagement on an issue, even though I say that exists with the variety of materials that were produced in support of this, being at a level of depth and accessibility unlike any I can remember before. But I guess the question is, given the extreme polarization of opinion that we saw here, did you get any sense from the engagement as to whether or not people could be influenced by additional information? Or is that pretty much what it is? They're for it or against it, and nothing can change?
Well, I'm not going to try and predict the minds of everyone that I spoke with. I do, I think people are very passionate about it, and I think there are folks that are very adamantly opposed, and there are folks that are very adamantly for it. But I do think that there are people in the middle, and again, this is all anecdotal, but from the conversations at the pop-ups, often people weren't ready to make a snap judgment because they with the sticker, because they wanted to go back and they wanted to take the materials and they wanted to go online and read through all of the reports and really make sure that they understood it, because it is a complex proposal and idea for people. So I do think that there is an appetite. I think people want to learn and want to know and understand the details, and I think that's a testament to the community. Even people that didn't know anything about it, when we walked up and we say a little bit about it, and they're like, oh, okay, I want to understand a little bit more about that. So I'm not going to predict how people may change their minds or move one way on the other, but I was very impressed with the community's interest and want to talk about it in our engagements.
And given that, do you think that there are any, just from your professional experience, any advice that you'd have for us if we were to want to engage people in opportunities to learn about, discuss this issue, not necessarily in a way that can lead to polarization, but allow for dynamic perspectives of the 78% one side, 77% of the other, to actually engage with one another?
I do. I think
You don't have to fully flesh it out now, but if you could just have a couple of ideas, that'd be great.
I do think that there is an opportunity for folks to talk to each other. I think it's, human nature. It's you find people that feel the same way, and I think the more we can get people into a room and having that conversation is always a positive thing. I think, again, I can't predict that that's going to change anybody's mind, but I think the more we can understand where somebody else may be coming from and what their circumstances are and what their background is that's brought them to their opinion, that can only benefit the county as a whole, the processes as a whole, and all of the studies and initiatives.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ms. Moore. That's a great answer.
Actually,
And that's,
do have
I'm sorry,
a
Ms.
tr-
Moore,
yeah,
please.
no, it took me a while to come up, but I'm just following up here, and it's just a brief one. Just expanding a little more on the discussion about the pop-ups and all meeting with people. Did you sense a shift over time? In other words, did you find more people seem aware of it than before, or more people are more hardened, or anyway, what did you see as a shift over time with the communication?
Certainly awareness was a big shift. So the pop-ups, the one thing I didn't mention is our pop-ups spanned the full month of May. So we really did spread them out, and awareness in early May was very different, in my opinion, than the awareness. Actually, we went into early June, so come early June of the study and what was happening there. So I do think awareness increased over time. It's hard to make a judgment on whether people hardened or feedback started to skew later in the process one way or the other, because again, with the strategic location of our pop-ups, we were going to get different types of feedback at different locations on different days and time. But I will say that, the feedback was fast and furious and ongoing. I mean, just the fact that there's been another additional, I think it's actually a little bit over 120 additional comments since June 30th, that's less than 2 weeks ago, just shows that people are still engaged and still interested in being a part of this.
That's great, and I think they will continue to be so. To be so, and I know we're going to talk about what we're doing moving forward, but the thought of getting people together in a room to sort of listen to each other, what is it you're afraid of or are concerned about? What is it you think is going to happen? I think, all of that on both sides could really help actually a little community building. So it's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the conversation, Ms. Moore. This is really excellent work. As Mr. Dorsey noted, a pretty unprecedented amount of public engagement and in different formats. I really particularly appreciate how much you took to heart the directive of our equity question to figure out who's missing and how to hear from them. One of the other things to just highlight, because this came up in a lot of conversations I had, was a point that was highlighted by the numbers, how many of the comments we received early on were in fact questions. And to Mr. Dorsey's point, right, about the breadth of material, to yours about how complex this is. So I really appreciated seeing throughout how those questions fed the frequently asked questions. If those who are interested in whether their question got answered, I really would encourage people to check it out. That list is long and growing, and really also appreciate your commitment to following up with people as well. I know just from some of the conversations or meetings I had, a lot of those questions got really specific, right? What can I do on my particular R12 lot? So the efforts to get into the specifics are much appreciated. All right, we will turn things over again to Mr. Ladd for options for consideration.
All right, thank you. So moving on to our next agenda topic, we're going to cover, as I mentioned earlier, options for either maintaining or modifying the key elements of the draft framework. So as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the draft framework represents one approach to expanding housing choice in Arlington. Within that framework, there are many different elements that could be either maintained or modified as we move forward to drafting detailed zoning text. Much of the community feedback from Phase 2 that we just reviewed focused on 3 of these elements, which are highlighted in bold on the slide. For each of these 3, I will present what is in the draft framework, along with additional options for consideration and discussion. The options being presented today were informed by the community engagement. Most of the feedback received was either in favor of the draft framework or in favor of a more restrictive approach. As a result, the options would in most cases be more restrictive, rather than more permissive than the draft framework. I'll also briefly touch on other policy elements such as building form and placement standards. The first framework element for discussion is the number of units that would be allowed within a building. The draft framework includes up to 8 units per building. The analysis indicates that housing types with more units, such as 6-plexes or 8-plexes, would be more feasible on relatively large lots. However, the draft framework does not set a minimum lot size based on the number of units. We have heard community concerns that the framework would encourage the consolidation of smaller lots. However, existing restrictions on a building's footprint mean that more total square footage can be built on 2 lots rather than on 1 double lot. This means that in nearly all cases, there's no economic advantage to combining lots. Staff has prepared options for County Board consideration. The first option is to maintain the draft framework proposal I just described. A second option is to tie the number of housing units to a minimum lot size. For example, this option could restrict the ability to build 6-plexes or 8-plexes on smaller lots, even if they otherwise meet the standards for a single detached house. A third option is to restrict or limit the number of units allowed within a building. This could be accomplished by either setting a straight cap, for example, no more than 4 or 6 units on any lot. It could also be accomplished by requiring a use permit approval above a certain number of units. A use permit would require public hearings and county board approval. However, the costs, time, and uncertainty of the use permit approach would mean that most builders would opt for by right approval options. Compared to the draft framework, options 2 and 3 would result in fewer housing units and housing options. 6-plexes and 8-plexes are the lowest cost housing options in the draft framework, so limiting these units would also limit the production of housing attainable to moderate income households. These limitations could address some of the community concerns expressed about the impacts of growth. And now I'll pause for discussion to hear your thoughts on these options.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ladd. We really appreciate this. Let me just ask a clarifying question as we begin, and then colleagues, if you'd like questions, we can also begin to home in on direction for further discussion. One thing I'd like to clarify, Mr. Ladd, frameworks 1 and 2 would be consistent with doing 3 at the time of adoption. Would that be fair to say? So you could prepare zoning ordinance amendments and general land use plan changes that would, exercise option 1, 2 to 8 units per building flat, to specify lot size amounts based on number of units, up to 8. And then at the time of adoption, the county board and or planning commission could say, under that option, they'd prefer to reduce the number of units allowed, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I think just really important to say the question before us is not necessarily how many units should be allowed, it is which units do we want staff to continue to develop options for us to consider. Wanted to establish that frame. So comments, Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, I'll be quick on this. I mean, I have, been open with a lot of people that the 8 units makes me kind of uncomfortable thinking about doing permitting or something. However, I've made it clear that I'm a little uncomfortable with the 8 units, I think like a lot of people are. However, I have always, in my long career, always wanted to have everything on the table to discuss. I don't want to take things off the table. So I'm fine moving forward with the options, but that's not to say that that's where I'll be when we get to the end. But I would like to have it sort of fleshed out and actually allow people to talk about it and think about it. Thank you. Thanks.
Great. Other comments from colleagues? Well, I would be happy to, oh, please, Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I share the concern with 8 units for this specific reason. I think that it would result in small one and likely result in more small 1 and 2 bedroom units. And I don't think that the benefit is worth the cost. I would suggest that some of our other tools and pursuing some other goals are the best way to do that. So that's one thought. With respect to just to sort of, I share the desire for flexibility as long as possible, but I also know you have to, studying in detail, you need some sort of guard rails to do it. So I guess my instinct would be to, I'm open on the use permit and development conditions, but I am mindful of the additional costs that result from that. So that's one thought. I would be more inclined to try a tiered approach that is sort of, that really focuses on lot size. So if we're going to result from the building code and the fire code in quadruplexes and greater not occurring on small lots, I would rather put that in code at the outset, because I think that that will reduce the level of anxiety of many in our community. And so that's what I support. I think that's consistent, said another way as to number 2 there. But I want to be transparent that I'm both at a place where I would want to sort of name those items in code if we legally can, and I don't support the 8, and I still, beyond that, I don't want to prejudge when we know that there's a lot that we still have to learn. I still have to learn on this process, and I think as a community, there's still a lot that we have to learn. So those are some initial thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Karantonis and then Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. A technical question. So first of all, now just to frame that, we've seen that the bigger the building, the bigger the envelope, the more anxiety there is. This may mean and how this fits and how this may not fit and what the impacts are for that. Of course, I would have many. I could argue for a long time that, for example, if a full 4-plex can be, as impactful as a full sixplex, just because of different demographics, et cetera. And I've heard also from many constituents who say, well, I would like to age in community, for example. I would like to have an opportunity to downsize, but I cannot either afford or I don't need that big of a unit. I can live with 1,000 or less square feet, et cetera. So I would, at this point, I wouldn't like to take it off the table, but I would like to see whether what Mr. DeFerranti meant with guardrails is a feasible option. The use permit cut. How would this be handled? How onerous can this be? How difficult can it be to create a 6-duplex with a use permit cut?
Well, to that question of how onerous would a use permit be, it would depend on how we developed the process for approval, but per state code, through a use permit, which is a special exception, it would, at a minimum, require public hearings and approval by the county board. And so that adds uncertainty to the process versus by right development, where if all of the requirements in the zoning are met, it's an administrative approval, and it's not under the county board's discretion.
Until now, we've said that, we have been discussing that you need a certain lot size in order to even start to think about that, right? More than 12,000 square feet. So how many of these do we have? Is it a common occurrence? Is that, there will be a market for that?
In terms of how many 12,000 square foot lots are there?
Or more?
Yeah, I could.
The blue ones in the.
Yeah, I could show the map, and that, if you give me just a second to pull that up. I don't have a number as to how many they are. They are certainly in the minority in terms of lot sizes. So this is the map that was in our Phase 2 presentation. And so we estimated that it would likely take 12,000 square feet as a minimum for the 6 plexes to 8 plexes. And part of that will depend, and I know a future topic that we'll discuss during this work session is parking requirements. And so parking requirements, play a big role in this because we do have a maximum lot coverage, and parking does count towards the maximum lot coverage. So if for an 8-plex, for example, 8 parking spaces are required, then you have already covered much of the lot, and there's not much area left for housing. But in the draft framework, we've set forth a 0.5 parking standard, so there could be an opportunity to reduce parking, and that was where we came up with the 12,000 for an expected viable lot size for an 8-plex.
Okay, thank you, yield.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, to this question of, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 8, for me, as I'm trying to think about this, in order to maintain consistent rigor throughout, I'm trying to connect this with marrying consistency with what is currently allowed versus coming up with arbitrary distinctions like the number of units within it. So that's the spirit of where this comes from. So I think part of the concern that I've heard from people, one is a lack of familiarity with multiplexes as big as 8. It's not a common thing. People don't have a lot of familiarity. And even though the research compendium provided some precedent examples, they were rightfully presented as illustrative and not regulatory. And most people just haven't come across them in their daily lives. So can we think about that question that you asked us in terms of not just regulating form as we do for single dwellings, but to get a little bit more prescriptive and get into elements of form-based codes that really actually ensure that what is delivered is consistent with the precedent images and the illustrative examples and some of the best practices of some of these larger multiplexes. Or, I've heard the city of Norfolk has come up with a pattern book to say this is what it needs to look like, right? So is there a way to sort of get at this issue with elements of more prescriptive form-based coding?
Yes, so to answer that question, that was actually something that will come up later in the work session.
Oh, it
but
will, sorry, I apologize. It can wait until then.
No, I can address it briefly right now. I think as we move into phase 3, staff is proposing to develop some basic design standards that would provide some of those guardrails that you're talking about to eliminate some of the concerns from the community and frankly from staff about making sure that new development is sensitive to its existing context. Now, just recognize that we don't have that for the development that's currently allowed, the large replacement homes that are being built in neighborhoods, but it's certainly something that we'd like to explore for missing middle housing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that. I'll just put a marker there while I get the, small equity considerations with existing zoning. I just don't think we should look at this as an opportunity to repeat potentially past mistakes, and we should look to improve where we can.
Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, Madam, I'll just finish up where I started. That's why I want us to be able to talk about it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I had
Yeah, please, Mr. DeFranchi.
one more. I've looked at some of the articles on Minneapolis, but I really, and I know that I've had parts of conversation. Have you, Mr. Ladd, or others on staff, do we know of instances where 5 to 8 has actually been done in the U.S.? I don't know the answer to that question, and I've focused on reading the 40 or 50 emails we're getting every day rather than at this stage. And I do know, of course, of the stories of it, but I don't know the answer to that question. I'd be curious.
So I think, but Before I answer that question, I want to go back to phase one of the study, where we engaged the community on what their priorities and concerns were. And I showed the slide, I showed it very briefly. But the top priority that we heard back in phase one was reducing housing costs. Yeah. And so our starting point for housing costs in Arlington is higher than it is in other places like Portland or Minneapolis. So when we did the phase two analysis, what we found in our analysis was that 8plexes could be physically feasible on the largest lots, those deep blue lots on the map I just showed, without changing the height or the setbacks or the lot coverage that we currently have today. And we know that new single detached houses are already being built in those neighborhoods that are 7,000 or 8,000 square feet. That's not typical, but it is happening. So by allowing 8 units within the footprint of a building that's already allowed and being built, the analysis tells us that 8plexes are the most responsive to that phase one priority to reduce housing costs, because they're likely to be smaller units and the land costs would be shared among multiple units. So going back to your question of Portland and Minneapolis and other places that have considered expanding housing choice, I don't know, I can't say why more units weren't considered in those other cities. We know that Minneapolis allows up to triplexes, Portland allows up to 4plexes. I believe they just passed some new legislation that might allow up to 6plexes. My understanding is that those cities, and obviously they're different cities, they have their own context, they generally have lower minimum lot sizes in their residential zoning districts. So Portland has a district where they allow 4plexes and the minimum lot size is 2,500 square feet.
Wow.
Arlington doesn't have a zoning district, a residential zoning district with that minimum lot size. We go down to R5, which is 5,000 square feet, and we go up to R20, which is a minimum lot size of 20,000 square feet. So without knowing for sure, I think that that might be one reason why other communities hadn't considered up to 8 and why we in phase 2 are considering up to 8.
Thank you very much. At the start, I was going to say, objection, you didn't answer my question, but then you did. That does not, I guess the thought is, the one thought, and then I'll yield, is just that the analysis is different. I just feel like humility in what we know about, the PES study is not divine word, nor are critiques of it divine word. And so because it's not been done elsewhere, for 100 years, we've had a system nationwide that is different. So I hope that is a helpful thought. It's some of the reason why I have some hesitation. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thanks so much. And I'm glad you brought up actually that analysis, because when we say, for example, likely price points, et cetera, it is based on an external analysis to bring in some expertise that we don't necessarily have in-house here. One of the things that I've heard regarding kind of this analysis of those numbers is, are they actually likely to be priced at that amount because aren't developers going to charge as much as they can? My understanding of the PES report is it is based on the assumption that a developer is charging as much as they can. So when you see those prices, it is not for example, perhaps $500,000 in some circumstances for a condominium within a multiplex. That is not based on any kind of intervention. It is not based on any kind of developer goodwill or charity. It is based on what the market would likely sustain and what the return on investment would be for someone to invest in it. That's correct?
Yes, those are market rate prices.
Okay, excellent. I find that really helpful. And so I'll just note for my point, as we begin to kind of come into consensus, I think from what I'm hearing from colleagues, there is generally a desire to keep on the table the question of up to multiplexes. And to do that in a way that lets building code, markets, geometry, right, of the lot coverage of a certain R district and how many that can be subdivided into dictate how many can be built. There is also interest in there's also interest in being able to consider a framework that would specify minimum lot size. So I believe the interest of the board would be able to consider both option 1 and option 2. And I'll just flag, my interest over the coming months is above all to continue these community conversations. I'm also interested in some analysis, and perhaps staff can guide me about the best places to seek this, is option 2, which is to say kind of the tiered system of minimum lots or number of units based on minimum lot sizes, is that effectively just our zoning ordinance codifying what the building code markets, again, geometry would dictate anyway, and sort of protecting us against the really weird outlier? Or does option 2 functionally mean that we are ruling out opportunities that might otherwise fit into our community that would be responsive to, again, the number one priority of the community, as expressed not only in phase 1 of this study, but as expressed in the Affordable Housing Master Plan, as expressed most recently in the only statistically valid survey that the county does, the Community Satisfaction Survey, that is the number one priority across. And so I just want to be confident that if we are going to codify exclusions of number of units on certain property, where we are have confidence that we are not taking off the table homes that could serve that number one priority while still fitting into the neighborhoods. So I think that's my big question for the months to come. But I think at this point, we're interested in seeing option 1 and option 2. So Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just find I'm going to invite all my colleagues, if you ever want, come up. We'll do a walking tour of Arlington. I've lived there since 1977. I am seeing things I've never seen. I'm going, how many is that? And I'm counting the number of units. There are 8plexes. And, there's everything there. And one thing you notice is how important trees are. So I will say that. But anyway, it's fascinating to me that I've been there so long and I'm suddenly looking at it in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Dorsey.
Yeah, and I'll just be brief. I know that, as Mr. DeFerranti expressed, and many in our community are wanting to know what we can learn from others. And, I just want to reinforce we can learn very little at this point because a lot of this stuff is pretty nascent, and the circumstances are very different. And so divining an exact best practice or expected outcomes from the experience of others, quite different. And I also want to just mention the proposal that staff has is quite different than what we've seen done elsewhere, whereas in the case of Minneapolis, you cannot get new single-family permits. You have to go at a certain level, or whereas in the state of, or in cities of Portland and other places within Oregon, they're functioning under state mandates with local implementation, which varies. So, there's just going to be really tough for our community to wrap their head around analogs from elsewhere because everything is so distinctly different that it's going to make what we're doing very much our own. And I realize that carries with it risk and uncertainty, and that gives people angst, but we have to get comfortable with that.
Okay. Thank you so much for that good discussion. And Mr. Ladd, thank you for teeing it up. I think we are putting a lot of work on your plate for this next phase, but we appreciate, as Ms. Garvey said, being able to have options. I will turn it over to you to continue with our next area of discussion.
Okay, so moving on. So the next framework element for discussion is location. So this is where missing middle housing would be allowed within the county. The draft framework includes new housing options in the zoning districts that currently only allow single detached housing by right. And those are, I mentioned them earlier, they're shown on the screen. It's R5, R6, R8, R10, and R20, and they are shown in yellow or orange, depending on your perspective on the map. An alternative option that could be considered is to restrict new housing types only to areas zoned R5 to R20 that are within a defined distance of transit options. Compared to the draft framework, this option would produce fewer housing units and options. In neighborhoods that are not near transit, teardowns would continue, but alternatives to large replacement homes would not be allowed. By limiting where development could occur, it is possible that growth of new housing types could be concentrated rather than dispersed throughout the county. And limiting growth to transit areas could address some community concerns about allowing growth in areas where residents are more likely to be car dependent. So with that, we'll turn it back over for discussion. You have the two options shown on the screen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ladd. Mr. DeFerranti, would you like to begin?
So I think it's important to say what we've all known, which is that that 40 or 50 years ago, the story of Arlington changed with transit-oriented development, and there was a unwritten, there was the thought had been density on the corridors and space allowed in the neighborhoods. And so I think that, you know, the proposal is a significant departure from that. And I think that's worth acknowledging. I guess where I am is I want, the status quo won't do, but I also want to tailor and craft our own solution. So option 1 and option 2, I could see, first, I think that, you know, land and additional density at some level is important for the people that we're trying to serve through this. And the people is first, even though the means is missing middle housing type. So, you know, that affordability is key. But I could see wanting to allow additional density on additional corridors, not just metro corridors. But that would be an addition to the staff's proposal. And so, and I know that's complicated, and I have shared with colleagues, there's you know, simplicity has some real benefits. But the question is, could you have a tiered approach with the number of additional units and include something that allows for additional density, say within a quarter mile of Langston Boulevard? So could we craft something that is both, is the question. Or not in this year? I mean.
Well, I think first the question is that, like you mentioned, Langston Boulevard, there's an ongoing process, as you're aware,
But other corridors.
right, for Langston Boulevard. And I think if I understand the question, it's, you know, could we have the proposal that's on the table, and then in certain areas, could we plan for more? You know, more height, or, you know, less restrictions, et cetera, through a planning process. That's the thing that we typically do within planning, and we're doing it right now with Plan Langston Boulevard. So it certainly could be done. It's not part of the scope of this study.
So perhaps your recommendation is that we would do it through sector plans, as we've done so often instead, like is at play in the Langston Boulevard plan. Is that?
Yes.
Got it. Okay. I'm just, you know, the conversations regarding transit-oriented focus there have been a lot of concerns on that. And from my perspective, I have to listen to those in addition to acknowledging that the planning that put the metro underground is 50 years ago, and we're in some different facts as far as the cost of housing at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. DeFranti, if I could just add, I think I'm not entirely sure that the history of concentrating development around metro isn't as germane to this conversation as you might think it is. I think a much better analogy is accessory dwellings. I mean, we're talking about gentle density, moderate density that fits within the footprint of single-family homes. That sort of decision to concentrate density around the metro and step down is, as we talk about, right, we'll have one on Saturday, the consideration of density to the tune of 300 units per form. So I think the question, to me anyway, is a little bit less, how does this fit within our historical sector planning exercises, which have been about, frankly, you know, residential multifamily development is commercial development in Arlington, and so commercial development relative to very moderate scale residential development, in which case we actually have talked about this at countywide points in the past. That said, it may be helpful. We have lived through multiple iterations of revisions to the accessory dwelling units. Perhaps we can, either individually or staff can assist us in this. Sort of, I would need to refresh myself about what the conversations around legalizing ADUs in the first place looked like, and whether there were considerations about kind of concentration around transit. I don't think there were, at least it wasn't by the time we began iterating on it, but I think that's probably the better analog than those, 300 unit apartment buildings, which I promise we are not talking about with the missing middle housing study.
No, I grant your point. I'm just reflecting what I'm hearing, and I think in order to move us over time towards something that could resemble consensus, I feel like at least acknowledging that reality seems useful. That concern of residents seems useful, even if I think your point on the whole is right.
Thank you. So Ms. Garvey, Mr. Cantonis, Mr. Dorsey.
Yeah, I'll be consistent. I want to keep everything on the table so that we can talk about it. And, assuming, and I understand the point about transit, whatever. I mean, but, as I brought back and report a little on micro-transit in Hamburg, just because we've been doing it that way for 40 years doesn't mean that we can't maybe come up with some other ways to provide better transit, actually, for people, in less dense areas, and that might actually be a good thing. So I don't want to connect those two. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Karantonis?
This is a question for Mr. Lamb. So I hear the desire for tailoring, et cetera, it's a complex desire. It doesn't necessarily have to do with transit, because we have, in the last few years, we have seen radical shifts in, the way we use our homes, how long we stay in our homes, how often we use our personal transit, how often we use our public transit, et cetera. So Arlington is relatively small. And what I heard from my constituents, especially in middle Arlington and south Arlington, is, okay, if the tailoring is close to transit, and this is basically a criteria, then the vast north will be completely excluded, and that will perpetuate also an inequality in transit distribution, transit availability, because actually it's the ridership that makes transit happen, not the other way around. We are not in France; we are here. So what would be the if we define these pedestrian sheds? What would be in, how much would be out?
I think if you'll indulge me, we put on the screen here just an example. If the county board did want to go in this direction, a 3/4 mile walk shed from the metro rail stations, a 1/4 mile from the priority and premium transit network that's defined in our master transportation plan. We've actually mapped this, and so I will pull that up. Just to give a visual, and I think it does, Mr. Karantonis, if my computer doesn't freeze, it does show, I think, the pattern that you describe, and there we go. Where the blue areas would be three areas that are, and again, these are the R5 to R20 zoned areas. So the 3/4 mile from a metro station, there are some areas within Arlington that have that single detached zoning only that are, within a 3/4 of a mile, which is I think a reasonable walk to a metro station. And then we also mapped a 1/4 mile from those premium and priority transit networks. Those are shown in the light green. And then the yellow areas are outside those distances. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it's helpful to me.
Thank you. Mr. Dorsey?
Yeah, I'll just say that, understanding the spirit of the question with the advent in mobility options that we're providing, I'm not sure how much utility the existing Metro Rail walk sheds even provide us, given the way people are going to be moving around. But more than that, I see this as something, I just have questions about how you would, how this would work when bus networks change. Those can always be adjusted. So would this be envisioned that someone would believe that somehow they're, not in an area that is eligible for missing middle, but we shift the bus route, and part of that process is saying, hello, you're now in an area?
That is a challenge to this approach.
Okay. Yeah, and just another comment on this. This is very much, the proximity to transit is very much a conversation based on today, not the next 20 years when we're, at least industry is trying to move us towards connected and autonomous vehicles, which obviate the need for people to move in ways that we do today. And so, yeah, I think I'm where you are, Madam Chair. I get the idea, but to me, I just don't think it may solve a pain point today, but create many, 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 many more pain points in the future as we evolve.
And I'll just say, maybe in wrapping up, there are things that I think proximity to transit is very useful for, right? Concentrating, again, as I was indicating, very significant amounts of density, absolutely. Determining to foreshadow what's coming next, parking requirements, right? And we have done that, I think, throughout the county. We've actually codified that into things, for example, like another example of a use that is allowed throughout the county, childcare, right? Residential childcare. And we do vary the parking requirements based on proximity to transit. So I don't mean to make it sound as though I discount that as a useful tool. I think it is a useful tool for some things. I would just say, I think if we, Mr. Carantonis' point is one that I'm really mindful of, and I really appreciated Mr. Different, the goal of kind of trying to seek some consensus or ultimately being able to proceed with a policy that is not polarizing, is in fact a widespread policy. I think this is an interesting kind of flashpoint among neighborhoods that I have found. I think the real trade-off probably is lot size versus proximity to transit when it comes to, kind of which of these forms could be supported. And I know that people feel in different neighborhoods very passionately about the idea that either their neighborhood is not an appropriate place for it, or that if we are going to pursue this, it needs to be something that this county pursues together for the first time, a housing policy that can really apply to all of us. So I think it might resolve some concern to adopt a transportation or transit-based approach. I think it might exacerbate some others. So, but I do appreciate the point about trying to get to something that more Arlingtonians can feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I mean, sometimes you read the slide deck and you have one opinion, and between you, Mr. Dorsey, and Mr. Carantonis, and the implementation of something like this, I have the annoyance of being persuaded.
Try not to do it again.
Thank you so much. Mr. Ladd, over to you.
All right, so the next framework element for discussion, this is our third one, is parking requirements. The draft framework's minimum parking requirement is 0.5 spaces per unit, as I mentioned, compared to the current 1 space per unit for most single detached houses. So for example, a fourplex would only be required to provide 2 spaces, although a builder might choose to provide more spaces based on market demand. The rationale for reducing parking requirements is that some areas have good transit access, as we just discussed, and residents might choose not to own a vehicle. Other areas further away from transit typically have low utilization of on-street public parking. Reducing parking requirements encourages the use of those existing parking areas on street rather than paving over green space. The fixed minimum parking requirement currently in the draft framework could be increased, could be decreased, or it could be even eliminated. And that's option 2 would be eliminating a parking requirement. And that's something that the other communities have been doing. The third option on the slide is to vary parking requirements based on site-specific factors. These factors could include things like proximity to transit options, cul-de-sac locations, or demonstrated on-street parking availability. Options with lower parking requirements, such as 0.5 spaces per unit, would at least partially allow the market to determine parking demand, which could support tree canopy goals and stormwater management by not requiring more parking than necessary. Lower parking requirements also encourage use of existing pavement, that is, on-street parking. However, there are highly localized areas within the county where parking supply is limited. Options with a higher parking requirement, such as 1 space per unit, could address community feedback to prioritize on-street parking availability for existing residents. Higher requirements could also reduce the area available for tree canopy, increase housing costs, and make stormwater management more challenging. The option for variable parking requirement could account for site-specific factors that influence availability and demand. There's also precedent in the zoning ordinance for allowing reduced parking based on a survey of on-street parking occupancy. We currently allow this for accessory dwellings. However, parking surveys could add time and uncertainty to the development process. And a little bit on parking policies and parking data that we have for the county. So the county's master transportation plan, which is an element of our comprehensive plan, includes policies related to parking requirements. One policy is to ensure that minimum parking needs are met and that excessive parking is not built. The MTP also encourages use of on-street parking in residential neighborhoods and sets a goal of parking occupancy of 60 to 85% for streets, and that's for streets without residential permit parking restrictions. As part of the RPP review a few years ago, the county did a detailed study of on-street parking occupancy in 4 areas, as shown on the map. This study found that parking occupancy in RPP and unmanaged blocks was typically 20 to 45%, well below the MTP goal. This data suggests that most residential neighborhoods have excess on-street parking supply that could be better utilized. And so we will turn it back over to you for discussions on the parking options.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ladd. Mr. Dorsey, you want to start us off?
Sure. You know, this one is, it's a big one. You know, parking means a lot, not just in terms of the use of your own personal vehicle, but the ability to have people visit your home, your house serviced in very many ways, and the lack of availability is something that is a big pain point. So, you know, I just will lead. I'm pretty interested in probably number 3 is my preferred outcome, to figure out how we vary requirements based on factors. For me, on-street parking availability is the biggest. But I will say that overall, I do believe, and I have a question before I get to that conclusion. Do we have a sense of the number of dwelling units in Arlington that do not have an occupant with a primary vehicle?
So your question is on vehicle ownership for households?
Yeah, but not by for households, exactly.
Right. Yes, so I believe the data is about 12% of households in Arlington don't have a vehicle, and then the other number that I always remember is 51% have only one vehicle per household.
Right. So I think that tells me that, you know, we do have to acknowledge the reality that personal vehicles are associated with dwelling units overall. Now, the instructive thing there is this a matter of regulatory concern or market concern? It seems that you'd be pretty stupid to build something and did not allow at least everyone in a unit to have the ability to have a parking space. So I think the market will take care of this, but I think there might be a way to figure out how to, you know, not leave the community with a trust us, it'll work out, but to have a verify component with number 3. So I think that's what I'm interested in.
Mr. Carantonis.
Yeah, thank you. I fully align with the concerns that Mr. Dorsey has conveyed and also the preference. Since it's true that the average, you know, there are 12% or more of Arlington households who don't own a car. They're mostly in transit corridors, though, and there is also an equity concerns people have. Sometimes they need a car to drive to their jobs, etc. And they, you know, in certain places, in my neighborhood, for example, this is a common concern. I do think that this is an element of tailoring, and we should be exploring all possibilities. What we hear very often from neighbors, from constituents is, okay, developers want, you know, will take the minimum and then they will rely on the curb. And I do believe that we have regulatory means to dissuade them to do that and to proper plan for their development, like we do that with, you know, the bigger developers. So that's my preference.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, I don't know if you're going to be doing options when you come down to the end and looking at both things, but I'm most interested in 3, but, you know, also 1. I think 2 is the one I'm not ready for. I suspect, you know, maybe decades from now, and we're looking back, you know, that zoning will change because people maybe won't have cars much anymore because they won't need them, possibly. We'll just have a car that we call or a robot that we call, who knows. Anyway, so I would put my my vote at the moment, if you will, or whatever you want to call it, on probably the varying parking requirements, in part to reassure people, I think, because it's just a very emotional issue, parking. Thanks.
And I'll just align that there's one particular cul-de-sac that I've looked at and that comes to mind, and then there's one-way street that I drove this Sunday Parking is deeply felt, as are a lot of these issues. So I'm inclined towards option 3. And I think, beyond that, I don't, option 2 is not my instinct. And I feel like through option 3 and providing some predictability, some assurances, then we could consider beyond that to the pieces of 1 that work. But I really would like to start with 3 as well.
I think we are very much aligned for all of the reasons that my colleagues have said. The only thing I'll raise, I think Mr. Dorsey especially put it really well, that we want to reflect the reality of our community, which is both that there is probably not a need to park it as aggressively as 1 space per unit, or require as much parking as 1 space per unit, because 50% of our households only have one car per unit. That means there'll be room to flex a little bit there, but assuming something that is probably more ambitious than what the way people live now, and as Mr. Cantonis noted, especially around transit corridors, is probably a recipe for causing the kind of conflict that makes people so sensitive. So I do agree with that. I guess the only question I had was just on-street parking availability changes, right? We know that, like when somebody petitions for an RPP, it's a point in time. Sometimes they succeed and sometimes they fail. So, I mean, you could, for example, have plenty of on-street parking availability at the time something is built, parked at a lower ratio. That changes over time. I mean, have we thought at all about the fact that whereas RPP is relative, or residential permit parking is relatively easy to sort of maybe change over time, whether a parking spot has been built on a property is less so? Any thoughts about just sort of the difficulties of pegging it to such a variable relative to something like proximity to transit or cul-de-sac or otherwise placement of the property?
I'm not sure I totally follow the question.
Just that on-street parking, the amount of on-street parking availability doesn't seem static. It seems like something that changes a lot. All of these other considerations, notwithstanding the very good points raised about how bus lines can change, but like proximity to Metro Rail or an existing high-speed bus stop, or location in a cul-de-sac. Otherwise, those things seem relatively fixed to me.
It could change over the course of decades, I suppose. As neighborhoods change.
Right. Whereas it seems like residential or occupancy of the curb could change much faster than those other things.
No, I think what I was trying to say is that on-street parking availability could change as land uses change, but land uses change very slowly.
Okay. So do we have indications that on-street parking availability doesn't change rapidly and does in fact change pretty slowly from previous?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Melissa McMahon from the Department of Environmental Services to come up and address that.
Okay, thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is Melissa McMahon. I'm the parking manager, parking and curb space manager. And what I'd like to, a data point to bring to bear is that we are in the midst of finalizing an update to the occupancy study that Mr. Ladd referred to that was done for the RPP review. And that is part of our commitment to the RPP review, is that we would go back and look and see how things are looking today. And preliminarily, the data that we're seeing in those final numbers is that it's not changing. So as of 2017 to 2019 data, and then 2022 data, occupancy in RPP and unmanaged areas are still under 50%. And in fact, in some of the sub areas, I would say it's actually gone down. But we know a lot of things have also happened. We are still not fully out of COVID. Activities of households, as was referenced earlier tonight, people's work habits, life habits, still a little bit in flux. So I'm not going to claim that anything about the RPP policy necessarily solidified a decline over time, but I would say that we don't see, and there isn't any literature that would lead me to believe that there's rapid fluctuation. But what we do see is spot differences. We see one block, actually, I would say like a face of a block at a time, where you might see 85% occupancy. but the blocks beside it are actually well under 65% occupied. And sometimes that's the nature of 1 or 2 households at a time, but in a given zone, it's manageable because you don't have to walk more than a block to find a block that has room for your car. You just might not be able to park in front of your house. And so that occurred back in the data in 2017 to 19. It's occurred again in these data, and it doesn't lead to any change in the overall perspective of availability in our residential streets.
That is incredibly helpful. Thank you very much. So actually, we might be more likely to change where the premium transit networks are before the occupancy of the curb space changes, given that we're updating the MTP next year, right? So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I think we are pretty clear on that one, and interest in Framework 3 being able to vary the parking requirements based on the locational factors, on-street parking availability included.
All right. So we have just a few more slides on additional framework elements, and then also, then we'll talk about next steps on moving into phase 3. So as I mentioned earlier, there are some framework elements that received less community feedback in our engagement. Staff proposes to move forward with the current draft framework standards for building height, setbacks, and maximum building square footage. Additional options for consideration are provided on the column on the right-hand side of the slide if the county board wishes to discuss any of those. And then we have another one of these. Similarly, staff is proposing to maintain the draft framework's limit on the number of townhouses within a development, as well as not allowing reduced lot sizes or allowing detached accessory dwellings in combination with the new missing middle housing types. The draft framework, as we mentioned on a topic earlier, the draft framework did not specify any design standards, such as, just as an example here, requiring building orientation, buildings to be oriented to the street, or the placement of parking spaces or garages within a lot. So staff is proposing, as I said, to develop those basic design standards, and those would be incorporated into the draft zoning text in phase 3. One of the themes that came through clearly from our phase 2 engagement is a desire to revisit the current standards of single detached housing. While we heard from many that missing middle housing would be a net benefit for the environment, there were also concerns about localized impacts on the environment, including tree canopy from redevelopment. We know these impacts are already occurring with single detached redevelopment. County staff will be releasing a draft of the upcoming Forestry and Natural Resources Plan soon. This plan is proposed to become a new element of the county's comprehensive plan. Both the missing middle housing study and the FNRP process have identified some overlapping priorities and issues. This slide previews some of the policies that will be included in the draft FNRP. They include maintaining the current countywide tree canopy goal of 40%, seeking state legislation to provide more tools to regulate tree canopy, and developing tools to encourage tree conservation and planting above the minimum requirements, which are set by state code. The draft FNRP also recommends studying changes to the zoning ordinance to better support natural resources, including lot coverage standards and setback requirements for both single detached and missing middle housing. And finally, as we move forward from today's work session, we'll enter the third phase of the study. Based on your guidance today, staff will begin developing draft zoning text and GLUP amendments. After Labor Day, the county board will begin its engagement period, which will run into October. In November, we anticipate coming before the Planning Commission and board with a request to advertise the proposed text and amendments. We anticipate that both bodies would consider action on these amendments in December. Both sets of meetings in November and December will include public hearings. And so that concludes our presentation, and we'll turn it back over to you for final discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ladd. Why don't we do this, colleagues? Why don't we take up the questions about additional framework elements or areas of study first, and then we'll conclude by talking about engagement and our own expectations and aspirations for this next phase. Are there feedback or questions about any of the items regarding the additional framework elements? I think these are things, as Mr. Ladd intimated, have not necessarily been the top things that have surfaced in our engagement with neighbors or in the public comments, but are nevertheless pretty important. Ms. Garvey, did you want to start?
Yeah, I had a quick question, actually. What is the thinking behind limiting townhouses to no more than 3 anywhere? Just curious.
So in terms of the townhouse limitation, again, it's thinking about being sensitive to the existing context of the neighborhood, which is something that we heard a lot in phase 1. So if you think about a lot and townhouses that we expect would be oriented towards the street, once you get to 3, you're still sort of at that house scale. And staff's thinking is that once you go beyond 3 within a row, you're getting sort of beyond the context of most existing neighborhoods in Arlington. You're getting to a building width that's getting a little bit wider, and would probably be difficult to accommodate in most of the lots anyways, given existing lot widths.
Okay, I mean, I can see where maybe 4 would fit, in it, but it sort of fits with the whole issue of design standards, which I am interested in doing. I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. And actually, this is a great opportunity to confirm something that I've heard from in a lot of conversations is, couldn't someone buy up multiple properties and build more? But I think the major protection there is the setback requirements, right?
Well, so all right. I mentioned this earlier about lot consolidation in the presentation, and actually it's it's less the setbacks and more there's a provision in the zoning ordinance that limits the footprint of a building. And so and there's actually a cap on that per lot. So if you were to combine lots, you would be likely to exceed that cap. And so therefore, it's more advantageous to keep the lots as they are. You would get more square footage.
Okay.
If you had, say, 2 6,000 square foot lots, you would be able to develop by right more square footage. And this is true today for single detached housing. You can build 2 houses, and you can build more overall square footage than if you combine those lots, your square footage would be limited.
Right. And, but you couldn't, for example, build what effectively becomes 6 townhouses by keeping the 2 in a row, by keeping the 2 properties distinct, not consolidating them, because there's going to be a setback required.
Right, that's correct. There would be a setback requirement. So you could theoretically, if 2 lots were available for development next to each other.
Which is, we see that not infrequently with single-family development, right? A developer or others will acquire 3 properties in a row and build.
You could see a row of 3 townhouses next to a row of 3 townhouses, and they would be separated.
In the same scale. Right. Okay, that's really helpful. While we're on the subject of towns, one of the other questions that I had heard a couple times was, to what extent this framework precludes different styles of townhouses. For example, piggyback townhouses versus side-by-side. Other than limiting to 3 attached, does the framework envision restrictions on what types of townhouses could be built, or whether, for example, you see more of a classic row house with parking behind rather than, a parking garage incorporated into the building? Are we envisioning standards that would preclude things other than townhouses with a parking garage on the bottom, or is it just the other regulations might kind of force that?
So this gets to those design standards that we're saying that we want to develop in phase 3 to address these types of issues.
Okay.
That really, the framework was at a higher level for that higher level of community engagement. And now as we get into the zoning text, we really look at how do we want to implement this? And what might those design standards be, again, recognizing that phase 1 concern that new housing types might not be sensitive to their neighborhood context.
Okay, that's really helpful. And for what it's worth, really speaking as one board member at this point, as you begin to develop those design standards, I have heard from multiple Arlingtonians that there is an affinity for that more traditional row house style than the large townhouse with a garage in it. So to the extent we're thinking about design standards that welcome housing typologies that people may find friendlier, right? I hope that we can do that. Mr. Karantonis.
Yeah, that's a very interesting conversation because in many conversations we had, there was the one very common geometry is the deep lot that is 50 feet or 60 feet wide and then it goes very, very deep. And of course, neighbors were concerned that the townhomes or the multiplexes would be built into the depth of that. So, an available regulatory intervention there would be to say, no, it has to face the front. It cannot be that kind of, tubular building that goes into, this is the kind of thing. So we would be basically limiting the types of housing based on the pattern book, which is a form of form-based coding, right?
Right, so we would be developing whatever those design standards are, and obviously in phase 3, we will, we'll come back to the Planning Commission and the county board for community review of what those are. They haven't been developed yet.
And that correlates also with the work on lot coverage and height,
No, that's.
or not?
That's this.
That's this. Mhm. Okay.
Mr. Kersey?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So as it relates to townhomes, we've discussed this within the context of existing single detached dwellings. Have we also married this to make sure that they're fully consistent with current duplex and townhouse districts in terms of what is permitted to be built? So there's consistency with current R27 zoning?
That's a bit of a complex question, but the short answer is the way that this framework is set up is that you would mimic the single detached standards. And so in the zones where duplexes are allowed, like R27 in the RA districts, there are different standards for duplexes. As an example, duplexes are allowed to have up to 56% lot coverage. And we're proposing lower lot coverage for missing middle because we're mimicking those single detached standards.
Which could be up to 53 if it were an R5.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. I'll have to think about that.
So,
some more
right,
as
so we would have different standards for duplexes in the R5 to R20 zones
Right.
and townhouses in the R5 to R20 zones
Yeah.
than we have in the different zoning districts that already allow for duplexes and townhouses.
I'll have to just sit with that for a while.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm good with these. Just because I don't have tons of questions doesn't mean that I'm aligned, and I think that there's some agreement there. The two requests. One is I've been thinking about what the PowerPoint is that shows the concept of a building envelope, because every time someone says that we're going to be like Houston and there's going to be an enormous height apartment building right next to my home, I feel like I have not succeeded in sharing what's in the proposal. And I have to take some responsibility there, but it's hard to hear that. And so if there was a neat little gadget that could show in a way, or like a GIF or whatever it is, that can show this concept of building envelope, that would be a request. And a second request would be, I don't know as well, and this is for the next phase, but it would be, I don't know all of the steps. By right is much more unencumbered than our site plan, our 4.1, et cetera. But there are standards in our by right, and I would like to at least, if we could tease those out at some point in the next phase, that would be helpful. It's also the case that, by right, we might, the mix of operating funding that we provide for by right might be a little different if there was more work to be done on by right. And I might not have this correct, but at least I could use a briefing to help me understand this piece a little bit better, because I think there's some who feel like by right means we're just going to let someone go in there without the land disturbance permit and all the other steps that we do as a regular course of business. So just two requests. Thanks.
Excellent point. Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understood, which I think I do slide 46, and it's just the intersection with the forestry and natural resources plan. And I think it's great. I am so supportive of looking at lot coverage standards, and can we,
Would you mind if we finished up the additional framework elements?
Oh, I thought that was part of it.
Well,
I'm
no,
so
I think you're right. These are the big
Good.
Yeah, I had just one other comment on the framework elements, if you don't mind, because I think this is a big one that a lot of us are going to.
You're running the meeting, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you.
Go ahead.
I appreciate that. I was just going to say, I think with regard to the other additional framework elements, there are an area for us, I think, for some follow-up is conversation, perhaps an additional work session about the related legal issues, for example, the Virginia Condominium Act, the law around lot subdivision. One of those areas is the idea of variances and whether variances could be sought. I think that is probably going to be something under consideration in the framework, and I'll just express for me, I think it's probably pretty important to pay a lot of attention to that. I think one of the things that folks rightfully worry about is that there could be greater permissiveness on number of units controlled by the things that Mr. DeFerrandi mentioned, but then those things could be subject to a variance sought. And so I think really being clear, I would love staff's recommendation. I will admit that my instinct is to say that, if you're building a missing middle form, you are not eligible for a variance. But I again, this is sort of related to, I need to better understand the legal framework here. So I just put that one down for discussion because I think it's related to that question about form. I also bring it up to say, like Mr. Dorsey, I'm very interested in the idea of a pattern book, like Montgomery County and I think Norfolk are proceeding with. I think it's probably behooves us to distinguish between design standards that will be a matter of ordinance and a pattern book that may be a matter of suggestion. I think it sounds like Montgomery County is looking to incentivize that through maybe reduced permitting times or training programs. I think we want to be sure that we are not codifying too much that is actually sort of pattern preference, right? So I think the ability of that to work as an additional tool and not necessarily part of the code is important. So that's my last thought on the framework elements. Ms. Garvey, start us off on a very important conversation.
Sure, I was actually aligning the two because you've got, on slide 43, your other options are study front and rear yard setback requirements to support tree conservation and stormwater management, which I thought was kind of similar to the same thing as the natural resources plan because we're going to consider changes to zoning ordinance to align with our other goals. And I just was simply saying I'm very supportive of that, very interested in it, and was going to ask you a little bit about the timeline, which you may have mentioned, but I didn't quite hear for people listening. Thank you. And actually, and then my assumption is whatever applies to houses, as you change the zoning, single family will apply to missing middle. So it's all together. You smiled. I think I'm right. Okay.
All right, so in terms of and again, this slide is on the draft forestry and natural resources plan and where that draft is not out yet, but it will be out soon. And so we're previewing some things that will be in there, and that will be subject to its own community engagement process as developing a new element of our county's comprehensive plan. I can't speak to the timing of adoption for that because it's a separate process. It has its own timeline. But in terms of, we're certainly aware and we have heard through this study, the interest in things like lot coverage, things like setbacks, particularly in the way that they can support our tree canopy goals and our stormwater management objectives. In terms of something that's sort of outside the scope of missing middle because it encompasses both new housing types that would be enabled and also the existing single detached types. It's something that we're looking to add to the Planning Division's work plan in the near future.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it because this is what we hear too. We just hear a lot. Is ginormous an Arlington word? Anyway, we hear it a lot. So thank you, and this is something I'm really supportive of.
Yeah. Mr. Dorsey.
Yeah, I'll just add that I'm very interested in this. One of the theories of change here with missing middle is that we can actually improve our environmental and sustainability outcomes. We clearly can do it with energy. I believe we can clearly do it with stormwater. I also believe that we can do it in trees, but that it's left to a later conversation gives me some pause. And so, I anxiously await this plan to see whether it speaks to it. But otherwise, I think the question from a regulatory standpoint becomes, by right has been the preferred option because use permit review creates risk and uncertainty. My question is, what if there was something else where the only level of discretionary review basically you create a system where someone opts in to this, and by opting in, the only requirement is that they plant at a certain level to have 20-year tree canopy, like that they're choosing to opt in, and by doing so, I don't know, they get access to the pattern book, which is going to save them tens of thousands of dollars in design costs or something like that. But is there some way to figure out how to not make this our expensive, risky process, but require that they do something that we want that we can't require, and we maybe think about how we solve another problem at the same time?
I think it's something that we can certainly look into. I don't have an answer right now, but these are the types of things that we'll be considering as we go into phase 3.
Thanks.
Well, I'll just say for my part, I strongly identify with my colleagues in a desire to see this advance. And I think it's really, the point Ms. Garvey made is really important, that anything we consider for missing middle would be subject to the same efforts to address lot coverage or setbacks or anything else that we think can help protect our tree canopy on private property. Any other questions, lot coverage or additional engagement themes?
Well, I'll just be pretty brief. Mr. Dorsey's comment I really like. I feel like this slide, the bullets on the left side are goals. The stuff on the right, I feel like, an earlier PowerPoint said minimize or eliminate. I think the more accurate statement is minimize, even though the building envelope is there. And so I feel like a lot of work right here, given the success we had on parking, a lot of work on this issue and incentives would be really worth it, because it's so deeply felt. And I'd rather start from a place of honesty and saying, those, when there's rebuilding, there do come trees down. So I've heard from folks about watering trees. You guys have heard it. I just think a lot of work on this seems really important.
Yeah, I had a couple of legal questions that come up. Is that okay for now?
I think that's fine. We have our attorney at hand.
We do? I don't know
If this is a subject for further conversation, we can tag it and follow up on it too.
Thank you. So two questions that come up a lot. So maybe for staff, whoever should answer it. Can we set a cap? I mean, if you come up forward everything, because there's a lot of discussion, it's going to be, some people think it's going to be way more than 20 units and we're going to have this flood and it's going to be, if we wanted to, could we legally adopt this and set a cap on the number of units in a year? I don't know.
I'm going
Ms.
to ask the
Clark.
county attorney.
Yes, yes. It's on. Thank you.
So that is something we're discussing. Sorry, if we're staying with the idea of having these developments be done by right, that's possible. It gets a little bit more complicated once you get into the use permit realm, but that's something we'll continue to look at.
Okay, thank you. So we'll have that settled by the time we get to adoption. And then one more legal question that comes up a lot, which is, say we adopt this, and again, it's a flood or it's the unintended consequences, this is the people's worst fears come to, can we take it back again and rescind it?
You can always amend the zoning ordinance. Everyone who has vested their rights will be able to use it, whatever it is they vested, whether they've built it or properly applied for permits and gone through a certain amount of
So they could build what they're going to build, but if we decided this isn't working out well, we shouldn't have done this, we can go back to the way things are now, and then anybody moving forward couldn't do it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Respectfully, we've got an answer, and we can talk about it later, but we've heard from our county attorney on this. If you have a different opinion, we'd love to hear it, but not as a part of this meeting, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Ms.
Thank
Clark.
you, Ms. Garvey. Thanks for raising that.
Yeah.
That's really appreciated. The only other item I wanted to surface for discussion, which is a big one, is a strong interest that I have, and I think my colleagues have too, in the articulation of, in parallel to this development, the articulation of the opportunities for expansion of our moderate income home ownership programs. I think one of the things I have pointed out before, and forgive me, colleagues, for belaboring this, generally speaking, my understanding is that our moderate interest purchasing assistant program is undersubscribed, which is to say, not that there isn't an enormous amount of interest in moderate income purchasing assistance, but that there is not enough product for which people who are eligible for the program are eligible for. I think it is not every unit or every typology here would be within the band of what's affordable there. But certainly, if we're going to pursue some of the higher densities, there might be hope that there's some match between that and moderate income. I know there may be other opportunities to work with, for example, institutional owners of our district properties that might be interested in working on something that could be by design for moderate income purchasers. I know we have heard interest from community land trusts that this is something in which they'd be interested. I would really hope that sometime over the next couple of months we can develop with more specificity either what those plans are or what the further plans for work are, so that as this community hopefully realizes some alternative forms, we are fully prepared as a government and with our partners to make sure that they lead down the path of home ownership for our moderate income community members. So I think there are probably a few ideas about what that could look like, but I hope it'll be something we can develop in correlation. Mr. Karantonis.
Yes, and in addition to that, I would be also very interested to have it as a targeted program so that to see, how much more, tailoring can be introduced through the means of providing homeownership opportunities for people who today have absolutely no access to the market. Another issue that I wanted to raise is so far the work has addressed school impacts, etc., and they're moderate because they are absorbed in a normal trajectory and timeline of development over many years. I don't want to lose focus on that, and as we go with various fine-tuning and polishing here, I would love to continue looking at this. Also, the evolving economics of that.
Thank you. Right. Well, I think we have come to a close here. We have heaped enough on your plate that I imagine you are hoping we will wrap up there. I want to take the opportunity to close by just featuring, again, there is a handout that we hope that everybody in the room has been provided with. If not, I think it is already on our website. It is. And this is something we will be alluding to a lot. This is as I mentioned up top, no binding votes taken here, right? Nothing has changed in Arlington regarding our land use policies. We have a lot of conversations still to go. I think as anybody watching can see, staff has a lot of work still to do, and they will be continuing to engage with the Planning Commission and the County Board and some of our other commissions as some specific ideas about the zoning ordinance amendments and GLUB changes that could effectuate some of the goals we've discussed today would look like. But perhaps more so than that kind of specific conversation about the zoning ordinance or GLUB amendment text, I think there is a strong desire on the part of the county board, and I know in the community, to continue talking about the big themes that have been surfaced, certainly during phase 2. We are interested in talking about those as well. And so we are, as the board really, hoping to host this next phase of engagement. We are looking forward to doing a series of community conversations, which we hope will be an opportunity for people to hear from one another. Above all, for the board members to listen, for people to have access to subject matter experts, either on staff or elsewhere, as useful to answer some of the technical questions, but really above all for Arlingtonians to talk to other Arlingtonians. If you have participated with the county board recently, for example, in the conversations we've done with the community oversight board, you might have a sense of what these will look like. We are planning for at least 11. We want to be able to keep those groups small enough that people can talk to one another, and if there is more interest than 11 groups would enable, we will plan for more. We are also interested in doing informational sessions. Again, if you did engage with the county around conversations about the Amazon siting decision, you may have participated or seen those learning sessions wherein we brought residents together, voices, knowledge from not just the board or the staff, but also from voices around the region who maybe have some expertise in things like economics, other planning and land use, to talk about the broader context here for the missing middle. So we're looking forward to having those as a series of sessions that can be streamed or viewed as webinars for many more months to come. Those two strategies are things that we have learned from previous engagements, seem to work well, and we're looking forward to opportunities to talk. They are not exhaustive. As I mentioned, board members have been meeting with civic associations, with civic groups, one-on-one with individuals. I know we all intend to continue that. If there are other formats of engagement that community members would like to see us host, we would love to hear about that. One of my biggest takeaways from Ms. Moore's presentation is that we need to be thinking about some way we could do more pop-ups because of how effective that was at reaching so many more community members. So again, those kind of two ideas that are listed here are illustrative, not exhaustive. But I will say, I think really on behalf of all of us, we are looking forward to continuing this conversation. This is not even the beginning of the end. It is the perhaps end of the beginning of this conversation about phase 2. So with that, colleagues, thank you so much. Thank you to those who've joined us. We appreciate you. And to our staff, thank you so very much. We are adjourned for today.